Hello and welcome to Project Noon, a platform dedicated to exploring Hindu-Muslim dialogue. Our guest today is Professor Mohammad Hassan Khalil. Professor Khalil is a professor of religious studies, director of the Muslim Studies program, and adjunct professor in the College of Law at Michigan State University. His specialty is Islamic thought, and much of his research revolves around Muslim conceptions of and interactions with non-Muslims. Khalil is the author of Islam and the Fate of Others, The Salvation Question, which is again the topic of today's discussion. He's also the author of Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism, which is also a really interesting book, and I hope we can have a discussion with the professor in the future on this. And he's the editor of Between Heaven and Hell, Islam, Salvation, and the Fate of Others, and Muslims in US Politics Today, a Defining Moment. Well, before we get into your book, I just wanted to give some introduction to the Indian context, because from that point of view, it seems like a very important book and a very important intervention in the debates that go on in Indian public discourse. This might sound strange, but it is in fact a very common question in even Indian political discourse, as we see in the media. If you have a Muslim candidate, then he inevitably gets asked the question, what do you consider about non-Muslims in the afterlife? What is the fate of non-Muslims in the afterlife? And of course, this is part of a broader narrative in which monotheistic religions or Semitic religions are seen as being somehow more intolerant and belligerent about differences and diversity. Unfortunate thing is that many Muslims also do not have clarity on this issue in terms of the what the classical scholarship has maintained and what various scholars have said, and the diversity that we find in our tradition. Your book is a very timely and a very important book for us in this context.
Yes, for me personally, doing the research for this book was eye-opening, and it challenged many of my own preconceived notions and assumptions. And I'm happy to get into those details as we discuss the book.
Right. So coming to the book, of course, there are certain central figures whom you engage and whom you whose views on the topic you try to bring out, and included among these are Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiyya, and among modern figures you have Rashid Rida. I mean, of course, these are all very different figures and very they have different followings. Perhaps people who follow Ibn Arabi might not follow Ibn Taymiyyah or vice versa. But these are the central figures that you try to bring out, and I think the importance of going back to the past in terms of understanding this question is also important, because we tend to have this simple-minded or simplistic picture of the past and what Muslims believe about this question, and it almost always tends to be a very simple and a reductionist view that, of course, non-Muslims are going to go to hell, and this is a common view among non-Muslims, but also a common view among many modern Muslims as well.
Well, one thing that I found in my research is that many of the pre-modern Muslim scholars affirmed their belief in Islamic supersessionism. So they believe that Islam represents the truth. So let me be very clear about that. They were very, many scholars were adamant, this is the truth, this is the ultimate truth, and other paths may contain aspects of the truth, but it's not the full truth. Nevertheless, these same scholars envisioned a paradise filled with non-Muslims. And I think this is we have to keep in mind, these are two very different things, ultimately, when it comes to Islamic thought, that you could have scholars who believe in an ultimate truth, but then also envision many non-Muslims going to heaven. And this is kind of tricky. It's hard to kind of put this all together. But what I did in my research, in my study, is I looked at some paradigmatic figures. You mentioned their names. I also looked at other figures like Mullah Sadra and Shah Waliullah, and even just various, a wide variety of modern figures. And what I wanted to show was the various ways that scholars imagined God's mercy manifesting itself in the afterlife. And what I found, well, first of all, let me take a step back and say this. In my survey of scholars, in my study of pre-modern Muslim scholars, I found it very hard to find clear-cut examples of Muslim exclusivists. And what I mean by that, and here I'm talking about salvation now, I found it very hard to find Muslim scholars who said that all non-Muslims go to hell. It was very hard. In fact, I could only find one clear-cut example, and that was Ibn Hazm from Al-Andalus, from Muslim Spain, living in a context of Reconquista angst, who makes some very interesting, bold claims. But he was the only scholar I could find who very clearly makes this declaration. Every other scholar, even some scholars like you have the traditional scholar An-Nawawi, Imam An-Nawawi, who has some pretty strong statements. Even he, though, will say, well, but if, they make these qualifications. They say, but, and for some, the qualification is simply, if they never received the Islamic message, then God will excuse them. Of course, this raises a question. What does it mean to receive the Islamic message? And here we see a lot of debate and diversity. For some scholars, like Ibn Arabi, the famous Sufi thinker, it's not enough that one hears about Islam. They would have to actually see the Prophet as a prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They would have to see him as a prophet before they could be deemed culpable. And actually, Ibn Arabi says, well, there are thousands of degrees of paradise, and only, maybe a dozen or so are for Muslims, are for the followers of the Prophet Muhammad. But maybe we've come to expect this of Sufi thinkers. Well, what about other thinkers? Al-Ghazali is also considered a Sufi thinker, but maybe a different type of Sufi. Al-Ghazali himself speaks of most of humanity being admitted into paradise. Now, it may not be a directed, ticket to heaven. There may be judgment. There may be even punishment for some individuals. But he's very clear that the majority of humanity will ultimately be in paradise. So that means, and he even gives us examples, many Byzantine Christians. We're talking Trinitarian Christians who believe in the Trinity.
Right.
And he mentions the Turkic tribes of distant lands. And many have convincingly argued that these would potentially include Turkic tribes who were not Christian, who followed various local traditions. And this might seem surprising for many Muslims even to hear. And I think it's important to explain the reason he said this is because for him, one is only accountable once they receive the Islamic message, when they receive it in a way that's compelling. So they hear about the Prophet, they hear about reports of miracles and the true message of the Quran. And let's say they grapple with it, they study it, but they don't necessarily convert before they die. Even then, Al-Ghazali says they would be excused for not being Muslim. So, but let's even put aside Al-Ghazali. Ibn Taymiyya, who is a traditionalist scholar, who is often quoted in contemporary works that come from, let's say, Saudi Arabia, a very prominent, influential scholar today among many traditionalist Muslims, who often has a reputation that maybe, is exaggerated. Ibn Taymiyyah even will say, well, first of all, one has to receive the message properly. But then even after this, Ibn Taymiyyah has an interesting argument that he makes, which is that in the end, after all is said and done, and this is quite shocking. I was shocked to read this coming from Ibn Taymiyya. He speaks of every single human being leaving hell and going to heaven. In other words, anyone who remained in hell, they would go to heaven, and then ultimately every single human being of whatever faith ends up ultimately in heaven. And I know there are many people online who will deny this. If you go online, you'll see all kinds of denials. Oh, he didn't say this, or he said it, but then he changed his mind. These are all, to the best of my knowledge, modern denials. Nobody in his time denied this. In fact, his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya quotes this argument and expands upon it in 3 works. He makes the same argument in 3 works. So anyway, I've gone on and on, but the point is that you have Muslim scholars who they believe Islam, the Islamic message is the truth, or at least especially someone like Ibn Taymiyya and someone like Al-Ghazali. Islam is the truth, but God, out of his infinite mercy, will admit into paradise at least the vast majority of humanity.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of really interesting points that you made over there that we can go into all of these different directions. Just to come back to Ghazali's examples, which I found really fascinating when I read them in your book. The example of Byzantine Christians who were Trinitarians, and also the example of distant Turkic tribes who could have been polytheists and who could have been mushrik, in the Islamic sense. Despite these considerations, Ghazali still finds a way to accommodate them into the Muslim heaven. How does he argue this? How does he make the case for that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because this allows me to clarify the statement. For Al-Ghazali, shirk, which is to associate partners with God, which is considered major sin in Islam, if not the major sin. Shirk is only shirk when one has received the message, the Islamic message, the Prophet Muhammad's message. So, and he justifies this by pointing to, among other things, Surah 17, Surah Al-Isra, verse 15, specifically the statement, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا, or رَسُولًا. We do not punish, we being God speaking in the royal plural, we do not punish until we have sent a messenger. And so the understanding is that God doesn't just punish people for having the wrong beliefs. They have to receive the message first. They have to encounter the message first. And for Al-Ghazali, this meant that someone who's a Trinitarian Christian could not be considered guilty of shirk until they receive the Islamic message, the Islamic interpretation and explanation. And they receive it, not just they just receive it, they have to receive it in a way that in its completeness, in its most compelling format, so to speak. And for Al-Ghazali, a Christian who's Trinitarian, ultimately he argues elsewhere that we shouldn't say, they are not, they still ultimately believe in one God from their perspective, because they just, the way he describes it is the Trinity is basically 3 aspects of the one God. And it only becomes shirk once they receive the Islamic explanation, the Islamic message in its completeness, in its most compelling form, and then they reject it. Now we have entered the realm of shirk. And presumably the same applies to the Turkic tribes, who presumably were polytheistic. That their being polytheists was not in and of itself a problem. Now, I should point out, there are some other Muslim theologians, Maturidis and Mu'tazilis and others, who did say one had to arrive at belief in one God independently. But for Al-Ghazali, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say that.
That's interesting, because this, of course, opens up the way for Muslims in India to think about Hindus. and what they're doing and what is, popularly seen in, Hindu worship. Is it really shirk? In Ghazali, we find a case where an argument can be made that it is not shirk, because, I think pretty much the same thing is happening over here, uh, in terms of what he found in the Trinitarians, where you're trying to define or describe the different aspects of the same one God, which is again what is happening in in Hindu theology and Hindu philosophy. Brahman is one, but his aspects or his manifestation in the world is through these various forms. So this could, potentially be a Ghazalian case could be made to accommodate Hindus as well, I suppose.
Yeah, so it's certainly there. There are many Hindus who will say that they ultimately believe in one supreme being, right? They themselves will say this,
Right.
and so the question then becomes, if we're looking at it using Al-Ghazali's model, the question then becomes: have they received the Islamic message, right, in its proper, complete format, or have they been conditioned to regard the Prophet Muhammad as a liar? As how have they been conditioned to view this? And this will ultimately lead to a very interesting debate, right? For some people, they will say, well, look, if you have the internet, you have TV, you've received the message, end of discussion. And others will say, no, you have to receive it in a way that's compelling. And I think here it's interesting to look at the case of Rashid Rida in the modern era, because what Rashid Rida does, which is very interesting, Rashid Rida builds on Al-Ghazali's argument, but he gives it a modern reinterpretation. And what he says is that, you could even be a scholar of Islamic studies and you have not received the message in a compelling way. Because if you are conditioned to see things as obviously false, then that's a different, so that's not like Al-Ghazali's period, his context, where you are conditioned maybe to see something as possibly true. This miracle claim may very well be true, whereas we are maybe conditioned to be skeptical. And so Rashid Rida then, he wants to maintain Al-Ghazali's optimism. Remember, Al-Ghazali says most of humanity goes to heaven in the end. He wants to maintain that optimism, but for him, it's not simply you receive the message. You have to receive it in a way that is compelling, that moves you, that really moves you in the inside. And if you don't have that experience, then as far as Rashid Rida is concerned, you didn't really receive the message. Now, for Rida, that means God will judge you based on what you were able to access, what you were able to know. But not being a Muslim, you would not be culpable for that, according to Rashid Rida. Building on Al-Ghazali, even though Al-Ghazali never said that, but he's building on his logic to get to that conclusion.
Right. Well, there's of course also the case of Ibn Arabi, where Ibn Arabi, of course, has different arguments for and a different view on these matters.
Yeah, well, Ibn Arabi, at the outset, I have to say, the chapter on Ibn Arabi was the most challenging chapter for me to write. Ibn Arabi is not easy to describe, to summarize. But what I can say is that in his writings, he is very clear about one thing, and that is that, going back to that verse that I mentioned from Surah 17, Al-Isra, verse 15, we do not punish until we have sent a messenger. Right. For Ibn Arabi says, notice, it didn't say until we send a person, it says a messenger. That means for Ibn Arabi, the way he interprets this, he interprets it as, you have to see the Prophet Muhammad as a messenger before you can be culpable for not being Muslim. If you, in your heart of hearts, do not see him as a prophet or a messenger, like you've heard everything, this miracle claim, that miracle claim, everything there is to know about Islam, but you just don't see him as a messenger of God, or as possibly being a messenger of God, then you are not culpable for not following his path. There may be other factors involved, but when it comes to that point specifically, If you do not recognize him as the messenger, then you are not culpable. And that's, I think, what allows him to speak of there being so many non-Muslims. Here I'm using the term Muslim as the group that we use, as the way we use it today. So many non-Muslims going to heaven. And also, I should point out with Ibn Arabi, the truth is, there are all kinds of truths with Ibn Arabi. And so he's not quite like the others. The others may be very, they may assert there's only, the Islamic truth is the ultimate truth. And for Ibn Arabi, the Islamic path, it leads to perfection, but there are numerous paths that all lead to God in one way or the other. In fact, even the people who take the path of evil and end up in hell, he has a very interesting claim that he makes, which is that even the people in hell will ultimately arrive at, they will receive God's mercy. Everything ultimately goes back to God, everything. And so even the people of hell, they will cease, the punishment will cease, and they will receive God's mercy even in hell. They won't be in paradise, unlike Ibn Taymiyya. Remember, Ibn Taymiyya says everybody goes to heaven. Ibn Arabi doesn't say that, but he says even the people in hell will receive divine mercy.
There's, of course, that place where Ibn Arabi says that everyone is an idol worshipper in one sense. Yes. Which is really interesting, because ultimately you're thinking of God in limited terms as a human being, as a limited creature, but God in his mercy chooses to pardon that idol worshipping, or that that confining or defining of God in certain human imagination. And you mentioned, of course, in the same chapter that Mullah Sadra also holds a similar view.
Yeah, Mullah Sadra speaks again of God's mercy, God's overwhelming mercy being manifest in the afterlife. And this was what was remarkable to my mind, was just seeing these very different scholars emphasizing again and again God's mercy, God's loving mercy, the rahmah, which is related to the word rahim, the womb of the mother, the center of love and mercy and compassion. And they envision that mercy in very different ways, whether it's the majority of people being saved from the get-go, or many people being saved from the get-go. You have other people who speak of people leaving hell, going to heaven, people in hell receiving mercy, and hell's not so bad anymore. But they all emphasize mercy, mercy, mercy. And it just really shouldn't come as a surprise, because if you look at any copy of the Quran, a mushaf, almost every chapter begins with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the bestower of mercy. And this is interesting, and it's important to point out, because there is a modern belief, a widespread modern belief, that when Muslims emphasize divine mercy, that this is a modern trend. This is a modern thing. And what I found in my research was that this was hardly a modern phenomenon. This is there from the very beginning. You have numerous hadiths, reports attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that where it's very clear that mercy overcomes or overwhelms or overtakes God's wrath. Mercy is the prevailing attribute. And so it's important to stress this point.
Right. Certainly there's this hermeneutic of mercy that is common in all of these figures. And of course, there is, when we look at the diversity and the complexity involved in these debates, we realize that there is not one explicit or clear-cut Islamic view on this matter. But there seems to be a common hermeneutic of mercy again, which leads to this positive ambiguity that in one way or the other, there may be more accommodation for other people in the afterlife, in whatever form that takes. Right.
Yeah, and I think You mentioned the term positive ambiguity, and I think that's, to my mind, that's exactly what we're dealing with. We're dealing with positive ambiguity. We we have reason to be optimistic because of the repeated emphasis on mercy.
Right.
On the other hand, we really don't know. We don't know what's going to happen, and I think this is something people have to recognize, is that historically, the prevailing view among many Muslims was, we don't know what's going to happen, what awaits us. So it actually is seen as arrogant for, in the eyes of many at least, for someone to say, I'm going to heaven or you're going to hell. Usually, unless something is stated in the Quran, and there are really very few individuals whose fate are explicitly mentioned in the Quran.
Right.
Outside of that, one is left with Allahu A'lam, God knows best.
Well, there is, of course, a general pattern that we can see in these narratives, which you mentioned that, in the pre-modern narratives, there were two broad ideas. One was, of course, there was very clearly the idea of Islamic supersessionism, that Islam trumps other paths, or Islam is the ideal path, even though other paths might also be good. But ultimately, this has to also be seen in the context of divine mercy. Even though other paths might not be perfect or the ideal paths to take, God still accommodates people who have chosen those paths. And in the afterlife, there's more scope in that sense.
Yes,
so,
if I may add to that, one implication of all of this, is that you could have a Muslim, someone who says, I'm a Muslim, who ends up in hell.
Right.
And you could have somebody who says, I'm whatever else, and ends up in heaven.
Right. Just to pose a question to that, do you think, well, while that is the case and that may be true, do you think that these scholars that we're discussing, would they consider that the majority of the inhabitants of heaven are still Muslims?
Well, it depends then sort of who you look at.
Right.
If you look at Ibn Arabi, he speaks of only small percentage who are followers of the Prophet Muhammad, and presumably he's including a wide variety of people living after Prophet Muhammad as well. If you look at Al-Ghazali, it's hard to say. It ultimately depends on how he envisioned the population of the world, the population of Muslims relative to the world population. Al-Ghazali is very clear that the majority of humanity will be in heaven. So, and presumably he understood, maybe not, but maybe he understood that Muslims were not the majority of humanity. And by the way, I need to clarify, because I can imagine, maybe in the comments section, people will raise this point. When I say somebody says I'm a Muslim and they end up in hell, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that maybe they didn't have true faith. They of course, even in the Islamic tradition, there's a reference to a group called the hypocrites. They say I'm Muslim, but they're not really Muslim. And only God ultimately knows. And of course, the Prophet knew, and maybe others knew, but certainly it's in a modern context, nobody really knows who's a true Muslim and who's not. But yeah, to go back to your question, it's not clear. I mean, Al-Ghazali, it just depends on how he envisioned world population. Ibn Taymiyya, presumably, I would guess that he probably imagined most of the inhabitants of heaven, initially at least, being Muslim. But then remember, from the Taymiyya, everybody ends up in heaven. So he would understand then that they probably would be a minority at that point, assuming he understood the proportion of Muslims compared to the world population.
What's also fascinating in the book is the modern trends that we see in modernity and the different directions that ideas have taken. And you mentioned that there has been an increase in both pluralism and an increase in exclusivism as well. Well, I mean, of course, you also mentioned previously that in the pre-modern or the medieval or the classical Islamic tradition, you find that the predominant position was those of the inclusivists, and pluralists were rare, or I don't know if they were non-existent.
Yes. Well, first I should explain how I'm using this terminology, because this terminology is used in different contexts, a lot of different ways, and I use it to help me make sense of what I'm seeing. So exclusivists, I use that term for anybody who says all non-Muslims go to hell. Inclusivists say Islam is the best path, but God will save sincere non-Muslims. The question becomes, who's a sincere non-Muslim? That's up for debate. And then pluralists say that there are multiple paths that are equally salvific. So in other words, somebody could even be convinced that the Prophet Muhammad's message is true, and the best path, or maybe not even the best path, but it is a true path, but they decide to follow another path, maybe the path they were raised with. Could that person reach heaven? A pluralist would potentially say yes. So what I found was that it was really hard to find a pre-modern exclusivist, and it was hard to find a pre-modern pluralist. So people who said that there are multiple paths that are equally salvific. In the modern era, what we find is a rise in both exclusivism and pluralism. So you begin to have popular writers and preachers who come out and say, basically all non-Muslims go to hell. And they may even say that all non-Muslims have heard something about Islam. So therefore, anybody who's not Muslim, they go to hell. We also, though, see pluralists, especially as our world sort of continues to shrink, so to speak, and people begin to interact with one another. You begin to have more and more people now promoting pluralistic views. And in the book, I mentioned different categories of pluralists. They're not all the same. You have somebody like Abdul Aziz Sashidina, who is an Abrahamic pluralist, who speaks of the pluralism focusing on the Abrahamic traditions. Then you have others like the perennialists, who look at multiple traditions as leading to salvation, so to speak. And then you have people like Farid Ishaq, who focuses on deeds rather than creeds. And so it doesn't matter what religion you belong to, the focus more is what you're doing. And people like Jerusha Rhodes, who also says that it's complicated. It's not just what group do you belong to. There are a lot of factors, including deeds and so on. So you have a wide variety of pluralists in the modern era as well.
Right. And of course, I mean, just to add to that list, the perennialist school of thought represented by people like William Shittick and Sayyid Hossein Nasr, and of course, they try to situate their school of thought within the line of Ibn Arabi's school, which might be a debatable point to what extent they're accurately representing Ibn Arabi. And I mean, certainly Ibn Arabi would not have been a perennialist in the modern sense of the word, because of course he had this the idea of Islamic supersessionism, which was central to him.
Yeah, I think many perennialists recognize that they are not taking Ibn Arabi verbatim when they put forward their ideas. I think they see what they're doing as a modern reinterpretation of Ibn Arabi, taking into account what we know in the modern context and kind of building on what Ibn Arabi starts and sort of, but leading to maybe a more, pluralistic conclusion.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, they might, of course, see their school as an original idea, and while at the same time they are also drawing on traditional thinkers. Speaking of modern trends, I'd like to touch upon someone such as Zakir Naik, for example, who's again, of course, highly relevant to the Indian scene, and his views are highly influential over here. So what is the case of Zakir Naik in your book?
Yeah, so I when studying Zakir Naik, and I studied primarily his videos, his popular videos, what I found it was interesting is, when he was asked about the fate of non-Muslims, he had a definitive answer. And his definitive answer was that basically, if you are not a Muslim, you do not go to heaven. He was very adamant, very clear, very explicit about this. And so, a question comes up, what's the fate of Mother Teresa?
Right.
And leaving aside the debate about how saintly or not she was, just somebody who's a good non-Muslim who helps others, could that non-Muslim go to heaven? And Zakir Naik leaves no room for that possibility in his videos. And so I present him in the book as an example of a modern exclusivist, in the sense that he is, very adamant. He doesn't, there isn't even, well, God knows best about Mother Teresa. Other scholars would say, you mentioned at the beginning, I have a volume called Between Heaven and Hell. And this was based on, a product of a conference that we held at the University of Illinois when I was there. And I remember we had a couple of speakers who discussed Mother Teresa. And I remember one scholar said, people ask me about Mother Teresa, what is her fate? And I say, I don't know what her fate is. I don't know what my fate is. And was a Muslim speaker who was saying this. So, what struck me about Zakir Naik was he was very definitive in basically condemning Mother Teresa. And yeah, that stood out to me.
Right. I think that's unfortunate that such modern exclusivist discourse lacks ambiguity. The absence of ambiguity becomes a difficult thing to deal with. There's of course also the figure of Sayyid Qutb, whom you mentioned, and whom you say about him that there was a nuance in the earlier Qutb compared to the later Qutb. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Sayyid Qutb, of course, the very influential, often categorized as an Islamist ideologue. He was imprisoned in Egypt for a long time, for many years. And what we find is that in his commentary on the Quran, his tafsir, so to speak, he was not a traditional scholar, but he wrote a very influential work of commentary on the Quran. What we find is that in his earlier writings, he seems to be open to the possibility of, others attaining paradise, receiving God's mercy, and so on. What we find in his later writings, and keep in mind, he's been now tortured in prison. He's had an interesting, an intense experience. In his later writings, he seems to speak only of Muslims going to heaven, and not just Muslims, maybe a small group of Muslims. And this stood out, and again, very definitive, no ambiguity. That stood out to me as well. I mean, and so I list him as an example of a modern exclusivist because of these later writings. And these are influential writings. I mean, his commentary on the Quran, it's written in modern Arabic. So it was accessible to many and influential. Right. And so it's consequential that he was promoting this exclusivist vision.
You mentioned that both these trends are on the rise in the modern period, the pluralist as well as the exclusivist trend. Can it be said that the exclusivist trend is more popular than the pluralist one, or at least it is the more louder one, right?
Well, certainly loud, yes. Yeah, that could very well be. I don't know. I will say this: a couple of thoughts that come to mind. The first is that I would still say that even today, inclusivism, which is neither exclusivist nor pluralist, the inclusivist vision, the one that says, yeah, Islam is the ultimate path, but God will, out of his mercy, will admit into paradise non-Muslims. That to me still seems to be the prevailing view among Muslim scholars. As for the average Muslim, I'm familiar with the American context. And in the American context, what I've seen is that in the polling, I mean, at least the polling data that I've seen, it seems that a majority of Muslim Americans have a kind of pluralistic view, not an exclusivistic view. So yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe the exclusivists are the ones that are maybe the loudest. Maybe they get most of the attention. but they're not necessarily representative of the broader population. Now, keep in mind, I'm describing the American context. One would have to study each context carefully and see what the situation is there. But at least in an American context, the data I've seen shows that pluralistic views are prevailing.
Well, I think we've touched upon a lot of the themes from your book. Of course, I mean, there were a few more things that I wanted to discuss with you. For example, the idea of hell and how these various figures thought of hell differently. And it wasn't a very simplistic idea of hell being just a torture chamber, right?
Yes. Yeah, I will say this. I mean, for even someone like Ibn Taymiyya, again, Ibn Taymiyya, I say even Ibn Taymiyya because he has this reputation of being conservative, traditionalist, etc. Ibn Taymiyya, in his mind, hell is not a torture. It's not, well, there is torture for Ibn Taymiyya in hell, but it's not for the sake of torture. For him, it is a last resort, a corrective for those who would otherwise not, pursue the straight path. It is like going to a physician and you get a foot amputated in order to survive. You go through extreme pain, but it's for a greater good. And that's how Ibn Taymiyyah imagines hell. It's awful, it's painful, but it is the last resort for those who freely have chosen evil. It is the last resort, it's the last possibility for them to rectify themselves and to become better human beings in the end. And then once they have rectified themselves, that is when they are now admitted into paradise. Again, as a last resort for those who otherwise would not have changed.
Right. So, I mean, essentially hell is like a purgatory for Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah, I think you could certainly say that. And then for Ibn Arabi, hell, as I said, hell, they begin to enjoy hell.
Right.
So hell actually is not exactly hell. It's
right.
I mean, it's not heaven either. It's there's people are still veiled from God. There is what he calls a imaginal punishment. They imagine punishment, but they're not actually punished in that sense, in the traditional sense. And they experience mercy, and so they begin to actually find pleasure somehow in hell, which is hard to imagine, but that's how Ibn Arabi presents it. Right,
and of course he uses certain common roots in the Arabic language between adab and al-dhuba.
That's right. That's right. He says the adab, the punishment, will become udhuba, sweetness. And he says, there's a secret behind God using the word adab as the generic word for punishment. Because if you look at the root, it connotes sweetness and pleasantness. So once you go through the punishment, you get to that root, you get to the sweetness.
Right.
So.
Right. I mean, this just reminds me of a Quranic ayah, which, I don't know if Ibn Arabi makes that connection. But there is an ayah, I think in Surah Hadid, that says that about hell, that the outward of it is punishment, but the inward of it is mercy. ظاهره العذاب وباطنه الرحمة.
Yes. I find that verse to be extremely fascinating, and the fact that there's a door there, I find that to be fascinating also. Just the fact that there's a door.
Right.
I think yeah. Anyway.
Right. I mean, this again also reminds me of what Ghazali's position or understanding of punishment, that punishment serves a purpose, but then there is a secret behind it which cannot be revealed to everyone.
Yes. So yes, Al-Ghazali he has this very mysterious statement in describing the attributes of God, that every punishment has a purpose and there's mercy behind it. And then he says, as you said, there's a secret that I cannot reveal, basically. And everyone, of course, is reading this is wondering, what is that secret? What did he have in mind? Some people took it as a sign that he's secretly a universalist. He believes that everybody will eventually go to heaven. He never says that. He never, implies it explicitly. He's never explicitly says it, at least. So we can't say that with certain, but it's there. That idea is there.